The Anasazi civilization, whose existence spanned over 1,000 years, remains one of the most captivating and enigmatic chapters in North American history. The name, Anasazi, itself has an intriguing origin. Derived from the Navajo language, it means ancient enemies or ancient ones. Yet what we know today as the Anasazi was a highly sophisticated society that flourished in the American Southwest, particularly in the areas of present-day Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Their achievements in architecture, agriculture, and social organization rivaled those of many ancient civilizations around the world. But despite their remarkable advancements, the Anasazi disappeared from history under mysterious circumstances. Their intricate cliff dwellings, expansive trade networks, and profound spiritual practices leave us with a lasting legacy that is both a testament to human ingenuity and a riddle waiting to be solved. In order to fully understand the Anasazi, we must first appreciate the environment in which they thrived. The American Southwest is one of the harshest climates on Earth. The region is characterized by vast deserts, towering plateaus, and rugged canyons. Rainfall is scarce, temperatures can soar during the summer, and the winters are bitterly cold at higher elevations. For the Anasazi, this unforgiving landscape posed unique challenges, yet they managed to transform it into a home. They were not merely survivors of this environment. They became its masters. By developing highly efficient agricultural techniques, including the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, they established a stable food supply that allowed their society to flourish. Their most iconic architectural achievement was the cliff dwellings. These structures, often built into the sides of steep canyon walls, are not only impressive in terms of their engineering, but also in their symbolism. The cliff dwellings served as both practical homes and spiritual sanctuaries. Perched high above the valley floor, they offered natural protection from potential invaders and the elements. But their design was not merely functional. The dwellings were often situated in places that had spiritual significance. Many were aligned with celestial bodies, indicating a deep connection between the Anasazi and the cosmos. The very act of living in these cliffside homes may have been a form of ritual, a way of reinforcing their relationship with the earth and sky. But the Anasazi were not just people of stone and earth. They were also skilled traders and artisans. They developed complex pottery, intricate weaving, and finely crafted tools. Their pottery, in particular, is some of the most admired in the world for its beauty and sophistication. The Anasazi were also excellent engineers. They constructed elaborate irrigation systems to bring water from distant sources to their crops. They built roads, bridges, and ceremonial kivas, circular structures used for religious and social gatherings. These achievements reflect a society that was not only resourceful, but deeply organized. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Anasazi civilization was their social structure. Despite the challenges posed by the harsh environment, the Anasazi were able to create a highly organized society. They lived in tightly knit communities, with families sharing space in multi-story dwellings. These communal living arrangements suggest a society that valued cooperation and collective effort. But beneath this communal surface, there was a complex social hierarchy. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of specialized roles within Anasazi society, including priests, artisans, and farmers. The Anasazi also had a rich spiritual life, with their beliefs centered around a deep reverence for nature and the elements. Their religion was closely tied to their agricultural practices, with rituals performed to ensure a bountiful harvest and to maintain harmony with the natural world. Despite their many achievements, the Anasazi were not immune to the pressures of the world around them. Over time, the climate of the Southwest became increasingly unpredictable. Severe droughts, which had already been a recurring feature of the region's climate, began to worsen. The Anasazi, who had once thrived in this environment, found their agricultural practices increasingly strained. Crops failed, and food became scarce. This environmental stress was compounded by social and political tensions. Evidence suggests that the Anasazi were not immune to internal conflicts, possibly stemming from competition over resources or disputes between different clans or communities. In addition to these internal pressures, there were external threats. Although there is no definitive evidence of large-scale warfare, some scholars suggest that the Anasazi may have faced conflicts with neighboring groups. The cliff dwellings, while offering protection from natural elements, also served as fortresses against potential invaders. It is not hard to imagine a society that was increasingly isolated, facing both environmental challenges and the threat of external attacks. Some archaeologists speculate that these factors may have led to a gradual disintegration of Anasazi society. The Anasazi's decline is shrouded in mystery. By the late 12th century, the once thriving civilization began to collapse. The cliff dwellings, once bustling with life, were abandoned. The causes of this collapse are still a matter of debate among historians and archaeologists. Was it the result of environmental factors, such as prolonged droughts and the depletion of natural resources? Was it caused by internal social strife, as different factions within the society turned against each other? Or was it the result of external pressures, including possible invasions or migrations from neighboring tribes? The truth is likely a combination of these factors. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Anasazi disappearance is the fact that they did not simply vanish. Their legacy can still be seen in the ruins of their cliff dwellings, the remnants of their roads, and the pottery they left behind. But their physical disappearance is matched by a cultural one. The descendants of the Anasazi are the modern-day Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Taos tribes. However, these tribes did not simply pick up where the Anasazi left off. The connection between the ancient Anasazi and the contemporary Pueblo peoples is complex and indirect. While there are certainly cultural continuities, the Anasazi themselves did not simply migrate to other areas. Instead, their decline and disappearance were marked by a scattering of the population, with many groups moving to other regions in search of more hospitable lands. Yet the mystery of the Anasazi endures. Despite the many theories that have been proposed, no single explanation has fully accounted for their disappearance. Some researchers point to the possibility that the Anasazi may have experienced a sudden and catastrophic event, such as a series of violent droughts, that rendered their way of life unsustainable. Others believe that the collapse was more gradual, driven by a complex interplay of environmental, social, and political factors. What remains certain is that the story of the Anasazi is one of both achievement and loss. Their civilization, with its remarkable achievements in architecture, agriculture, and art, stands as a testament to human resilience and creativity. Yet their sudden disappearance raises important questions about the fragility of civilizations and the delicate balance between human societies and their environments. As we look back at the Anasazi, we are left with not only a fascination with their achievements, but also a sense of awe at the mystery that surrounds their disappearance. The Anasazi were a people who shaped the land, creating works of art and architecture that continue to inspire us. But their story is also a reminder of the transience of human civilization, of the fragile nature of success, and of the forces, both environmental and social, that can bring even the most advanced societies to their knees. The Anasazi may have vanished from the cliffs they once called home, but their legacy remains embedded in the landscape and in the hearts of those who continue to study and admire their remarkable civilization. The Anasazi, also known as the ancient Puebloans, crafted one of the most remarkable societies in pre-Columbian North America. Their lives were intricately tied to the land, their environment, and their community, with daily existence governed by a complex interplay of agriculture, spiritual practice, and communal life. To understand the true essence of the Anasazi civilization, we must delve into the daily lives of the people who lived in the high desert canyons, the cliff sides, and the mesas that dotted the Southwest. These people did not simply survive in the harsh and arid landscape. They thrived through remarkable innovations that integrated their needs with the rhythm of the natural world. At the heart of the Anasazi way of life was their deep connection to the land. The Southwest is an unforgiving region. In places like the Four Corners area, where the states of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico meet, the climate is harsh and unpredictable. Summers can be searingly hot, while winters can bring biting cold winds. Water sources are scarce, and the soil, while fertile in places, is also prone to erosion and depletion. Yet, it was within these very conditions that the Anasazi developed a thriving culture, relying on innovation and deep knowledge of their surroundings to sustain their communities. One of the most important aspects of Anasazi life was agriculture. Although the region is not naturally conducive to farming, the Anasazi adapted and perfected agricultural techniques that allowed them to cultivate staple crops such as corn, beans, and squash. These three crops, known as the Three Sisters, formed the backbone of their diet and their agricultural economy. Through careful management of their fields and the construction of sophisticated irrigation systems, they were able to coax abundant harvests from a sometimes reluctant land. The Anasazi made use of the region's arroyos, dry riverbeds that occasionally filled with water after storms, and built check dams, terraces, and channels to capture and distribute water to their crops. This innovation allowed them to grow crops where others might have failed. But the Anasazi were not simply farmers. They were also master builders. Their most iconic structures are the cliff dwellings, which were built into the steep canyon walls and mesas that dotted the landscape. These dwellings are a testament to the ingenuity and skill of the Anasazi. Built primarily from sandstone, adobe, and timber, these structures were remarkably durable and designed to withstand both the elements and the passage of time. The cliff dwellings served multiple functions. On a practical level, they offered protection from the harsh environment, providing shelter from extreme temperatures as well as from potential invaders. The positioning of these homes was no accident. By building their dwellings on the cliffs, the Anasazi made it much harder for enemies to access their settlements, turning the cliff sides into natural fortresses. The dwellings were typically multi-story, with each level connected by ladders or rope. These vertical homes were not only a feat of engineering, but also a statement of Anasazi ingenuity. Inside these structures, families lived in communal spaces, working, cooking, and engaging in religious and cultural practices. While the dwellings themselves were impressive, it was the broader architectural landscape of the Anasazi that truly stands out. They constructed entire villages that were interconnected by roads, with ceremonial structures known as kivas placed at the center of these settlements. Kivas were circular, subterranean rooms used for religious ceremonies and social gatherings, offering a place for the community to come together. These kivas were the spiritual heart of the Anasazi communities, where people would conduct rituals and hold councils. The positioning of the kivas within these communities was often deliberate, symbolizing a connection between the earth and the heavens, with many kivas oriented toward specific celestial events. Anasazi architecture was not confined to the grand cliff dwellings and ceremonial structures. They were also skilled in the construction of their everyday homes, which were typically square or rectangular, made from adobe bricks and constructed in large, interconnected complexes. These homes were arranged in a way that fostered communal living, with shared walls and common spaces that encouraged interaction among families. These dwellings were designed to maximize the use of limited resources and to provide the necessary shelter against the elements. Though smaller in scale than the cliff dwellings, these homes were no less sophisticated in their design. The Anasazi knew how to use their surroundings to their advantage, making the most of natural building materials and designing homes that could endure the region's extreme climate. Beyond their agriculture and architecture, the Anasazi were also skilled artisans. They created pottery, woven baskets, and textiles that were not only functional, but also beautiful. Their pottery, in particular, is highly regarded for its intricate designs and technical sophistication. Pottery served many purposes in Anasazi society, from practical uses such as storing food and water to ritualistic functions. The pottery was often decorated with geometric patterns and symbols that held spiritual significance. For the Anasazi, pottery was a way to communicate with the spiritual world, with certain designs believed to have protective powers or to bring good fortune. The Anasazi also excelled in weaving, producing textiles that were both practical and ornamental. These woven items, including blankets, mats, and clothing, were made from cotton and wool, using techniques passed down through generations. Trade played a central role in the Anasazi economy. While they were largely self-sufficient, the Anasazi also exchanged goods with neighboring peoples. They traded pottery, woven goods, and agricultural products for items that were not readily available in their region. This included items such as turquoise, which was highly valued for its use in jewelry, as well as exotic goods like seashells, bird feathers, and cotton. The Anasazi had extensive trade networks that spanned hundreds of miles, connecting them with groups in Central America, Mexico, and other parts of the American Southwest. These trade relationships were not just economic. They also helped foster cultural exchange, allowing the Anasazi to adopt new ideas, technologies, and religious practices. Religion and spirituality were at the core of Anasazi life. Their religious beliefs were tied to their agricultural practices, and their rituals were often centered around the cycles of planting and harvesting. The Anasazi believed in a pantheon of gods and spirits, many of whom were associated with natural elements such as rain, the sun, and the earth. These deities were invoked in ceremonies held in the kivas, where the Anasazi would conduct rituals to ensure a successful harvest and to maintain harmony with the natural world. The Anasazi also held sacred the idea of balance between the forces of nature and the human world. Their religious practices were closely intertwined with their daily lives, with every aspect of their existence infused with spiritual significance. Despite the apparent stability of their society, the Anasazi were not without challenges. The harsh environment presented ongoing difficulties in terms of agriculture, and the scarcity of water was always a concern. Droughts were a regular occurrence, and periods of prolonged dryness could lead to crop failures and food shortages. The Anasazi responded to these challenges with resilience and adaptability, but the pressures of their environment may have contributed to their eventual decline. Climate change, combined with internal social dynamics, may have caused a breakdown of the once thriving Anasazi society. Despite their advanced agricultural techniques, reliance on a delicate balance of water and soil may have ultimately led to the collapse of the civilization. Life for the Anasazi was a delicate balance of survival, spiritual fulfillment, and communal living. Their ability to adapt to one of the harshest environments in the world, their architectural feats, and their rich cultural life stand as a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Yet, the decline of their civilization remains a mystery. The same land that once sustained them also led to their undoing. And while their physical presence in the region has disappeared, the legacy of the Anasazi endures in the remnants of their cliff dwellings, their pottery, and the stories passed down by their descendants. The Anasazi were a people whose lives were deeply connected to the earth, and in the end, it is that connection, both their greatest strength and their greatest challenge, that tells the story of their rise and fall. The Sea Peoples have long been one of history's greatest mysteries. Their name evokes images of marauding invaders, seafaring warriors who suddenly appeared on the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, leaving destruction in their wake. But despite centuries of research and speculation, their true origins, identity, and motivations remain shrouded in uncertainty. What is clear, however, is the profound impact they had on the ancient world. The Sea Peoples were not just a singular group, but rather a confederation of diverse peoples, drawn from various regions, who collectively wreaked havoc on some of the most powerful civilizations of the time. Their attacks contributed to the collapse of the Bronze Age world, a period of unprecedented political, social, and economic upheaval that set the stage for the Iron Age. To fully appreciate their role in history, it is necessary to understand the broader context in which they appeared and the enigmatic nature of their identity. The Late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, was a time of great interconnectedness among the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites, Egyptians, Mycenaeans, and others formed a complex network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Cities like Troy, Mycenae, and Ugarit were thriving hubs of commerce and culture, while Egypt, under the rule of Pharaoh Ramses III, stood as the dominant power in the region. This interconnected world was not only marked by wealth and cultural achievement, but also by competition and tension between the great empires. Despite the apparent stability of the era, there were deep fractures that ran through these civilizations, including the growing pressures from climate change, resource scarcity, and internal strife. It is within this context that the Sea Peoples made their sudden and violent appearance, plunging the region into chaos. The first references to the Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian texts, particularly those of Pharaoh Merneptah, circa 1207 BCE, and Ramses III, circa 1180 BCE. These inscriptions describe a series of raids along the Egyptian coasts, attributed to a coalition of peoples from the sea. In the famous inscription of Ramses III at the mortuary temple of Medinet Habu, the Sea Peoples are depicted as a coalition of different groups, including the Peleset, the Cheker, the Shikalesh, the Denyen, and the Weshish. These names, while evocative, offer little insight into the true origins of these people. Were they pirates, migrants fleeing destruction, or a combination of both? The sources do not provide definitive answers, and as such, scholars have spent centuries speculating on the Sea Peoples' true identity and motivations. One of the primary theories is that the Sea Peoples were a group of displaced peoples, forced to leave their homelands due to a combination of environmental factors, such as prolonged drought, famine, and social unrest. The Late Bronze Age was marked by significant climatic changes, including a series of widespread droughts that severely impacted agricultural production. These environmental stresses, combined with political instability and the breakdown of trade routes, may have created a situation where entire populations were forced to migrate in search of food, water, and safety. Some historians suggest that the Sea Peoples were not simply invaders, but refugees fleeing from the collapse of their own societies. The Mycenaean civilization, for example, was in decline at this time, with evidence of widespread destruction at its major cities, such as Troy, Mycenae, and Pylos. Could the Sea Peoples have been part of this displaced population, seeking new lands to settle? Alternatively, some scholars propose that the Sea Peoples were motivated by a desire for conquest and plunder. The Mediterranean world, even in the midst of its turmoil, was a region rich in resources, including precious metals, agricultural products, and access to key trade routes. For some of these groups, the Sea Peoples may have been driven by a desire to capitalize on the wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not mere refugees, but opportunistic raiders, preying on the weakness of the great civilizations that had once dominated the region. They may have been drawn to the coastal cities and towns, which were often poorly fortified and vulnerable to attack. The Sea Peoples' campaigns were not limited to Egypt. They are believed to have attacked a wide range of coastal cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, from Anatolia to the Levant, including the Hittite Empire, the cities of Ugarit, and even the great city of Mycenae. The Hittites, one of the major powers in the region, were particularly hard hit by the Sea Peoples. Their once mighty empire was fragmented and destroyed, leaving behind a legacy of ruins and abandoned cities. The city of Ugarit, an important trade center, also fell to the Sea Peoples. As the Sea Peoples moved across the Mediterranean, their attacks left a trail of destruction that contributed to the collapse of several ancient civilizations. Perhaps the most dramatic evidence of the Sea Peoples' impact comes from the Egyptian records. In the reign of Ramses III, Egypt itself was under siege by a coalition of these maritime invaders. According to the records, the Sea Peoples launched a series of attacks along the Egyptian coastline, ultimately reaching the Nile Delta. In a famous battle, Ramses III is said to have defeated the Sea Peoples in a great naval engagement, though the full extent of their defeat is unclear. While Egypt survived the assault, the attacks were devastating to the empire, weakening its ability to maintain control over its vast territories and contributing to the decline of Egypt's new kingdom. Despite the Sea Peoples' dramatic impact on the region, their identity remains elusive. There is no single, unified explanation for who they were or where they came from. The names mentioned in Egyptian texts, such as the Pele Set, the Tjeker, and the Denyen, do not correspond directly to known historical peoples, making it difficult to trace their exact origins. Some scholars suggest that the Sea Peoples were a coalition of groups from various regions, including Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant. Others propose that they were a mixture of pirates, mercenaries, and displaced peoples who came together for the purpose of raiding and conquest. What is clear, however, is that the Sea Peoples were not a homogeneous group, but rather a loose confederation of peoples with diverse backgrounds and motivations. The Sea Peoples' attacks did not mark the end of the ancient Mediterranean world, but they did contribute significantly to its transformation. The collapse of the Hittite Empire, the fall of Ugarit, and the weakening of Egypt set in motion a series of events that would lead to the rise of new powers in the Iron Age, such as the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, and the Greeks. In this sense, the Sea Peoples can be seen as agents of change, playing a role in the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Their raids, while destructive, also cleared the way for new civilizations to emerge and flourish. The mystery of the Sea Peoples persists to this day. While we have some understanding of the impact they had on the ancient world, their true identity remains elusive. Were they displaced peoples fleeing famine and war? Or were they opportunistic raiders seeking to capitalize on the collapse of established empires? The truth may never be fully known. What is clear, however, is that the Sea Peoples played a significant role in shaping the ancient Mediterranean world. Their raids, destruction, and eventual assimilation into the fabric of Mediterranean society left a lasting legacy that continues to captivate historians and archaeologists to this day. The Sea Peoples' brief but impactful presence in the ancient world serves as a reminder of the fragility of civilization. They were a group of peoples who, for reasons still not fully understood, came together to challenge the might of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age. In their wake, they left a region in turmoil, but also one in transition. Their legacy may be one of destruction, but it is also one of transformation, a symbol of how upheaval, whether caused by war, migration, or environmental disaster, can pave the way for new beginnings. The Sea Peoples may remain a mystery, but their influence on the ancient world is undeniable. The collapse of the Bronze Age, a pivotal moment in ancient history, marked a dramatic shift in the cultural, political, and economic landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples played a central role in this process, contributing to the destabilization of several great civilizations, including the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and the powerful Egyptian New Kingdom. The end of this era, however, cannot be attributed solely to the raids of these seafaring marauders. The collapse was the result of a complex interplay of internal and external factors, including environmental stress, economic decline, political instability, and widespread warfare. Understanding the collapse of the Bronze Age requires a deeper exploration of the broader forces at play during this tumultuous period, particularly the interconnectedness of the various civilizations that were affected by these stresses. The Late Bronze Age was a time of unprecedented prosperity and interconnectedness in the Eastern Mediterranean. Trade networks spanned vast distances, connecting cultures from the shores of Greece to Egypt and from Mesopotamia to the Levant. These networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies, creating a rich cultural tapestry that supported powerful and prosperous empires. The Hittites controlled much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and parts of the Levant, while the Mycenaean Greeks ruled much of the Aegean. Egypt, under the New Kingdom, was one of the most dominant powers in the region, exerting influence from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north. Yet despite this interconnected world, cracks were beginning to appear in the foundations of these great civilizations, cracks that would widen under the pressures of environmental and social change. One of the most significant factors contributing to the collapse of the Bronze Age was environmental stress. The region was experiencing climate change during this period, characterized by prolonged droughts, and shifting weather patterns that severely affected agriculture. The Mediterranean climate, with its reliance on regular rainfall to support crops, became increasingly unpredictable. Periods of severe drought, especially in areas like Anatolia and the Levant, led to crop failures, food shortages, and population displacement. These environmental changes placed immense strain on the agricultural systems that supported these civilizations, triggering a cascade of social and economic problems. The collapse of the Hittite Empire, one of the first victims of the Bronze Age collapse, provides a stark example of the pressures created by environmental and economic stress. The Hittites were highly dependent on the agricultural output of their empire, and the climate shifts during this period made it increasingly difficult to sustain their population. As droughts ravaged the fertile plains of Anatolia, the Hittites were forced to divert resources from other areas to deal with food shortages. The decline in agricultural production was compounded by the collapse of trade networks, which had been crucial to maintaining the empire's wealth and resources. As food became scarcer and the economic system faltered, the Hittite heartland became more vulnerable to both internal unrest and external threats. The Mycenaean Greeks, another major civilization of the Bronze Age, also faced similar challenges. Like the Hittites, the Mycenaeans were deeply reliant on agriculture and trade to support their cities. The Mycenaean palaces, including those at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, were thriving centers of wealth and power, controlling vast territories and trade routes. However, the Mycenaean world was also destabilized by environmental factors. Evidence suggests that the Mycenaeans experienced a series of devastating droughts that caused crop failures and food shortages. These hardships, combined with growing social unrest and internal political struggles, left the Mycenaean cities vulnerable to external attacks. It was during this period of vulnerability that the Sea Peoples, a coalition of seafaring marauders, began their raids on the eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples' attacks were not merely the result of external invasion, but were also closely tied to the environmental and social disruptions occurring within these civilizations. The Sea Peoples, likely composed of displaced populations fleeing famine, drought, or conflict, sought refuge and opportunities in the wealth and resources of the eastern Mediterranean. Their raids were opportunistic, targeting weakened cities and regions that were no longer able to defend themselves effectively. The Sea Peoples' attacks on the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians left lasting scars. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was destroyed, and the once thriving city of Ugarit in the Levant was abandoned. The Mycenaean palaces, symbols of Greek power and prosperity, were burned and looted, and the entire Mycenaean civilization began to unravel. The Sea Peoples' raids, however, were not the sole cause of this destruction. They were part of a larger set of circumstances that included environmental stress, internal conflict, and economic decline. In Egypt, the situation was similarly precarious. Under the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, Egypt found itself under attack by a coalition of Sea Peoples. In a famous battle, Ramses III is said to have defeated the Sea Peoples in a naval engagement, but the damage had already been done. Egypt's economy, which had once thrived on trade and tribute from its vassal states, began to suffer. The destruction wrought by the Sea Peoples, combined with internal strife and the economic impact of the declining trade networks, weakened Egypt's ability to project power and maintain control over its territories. Egypt's new kingdom, which had once been a beacon of strength and prosperity, was now struggling to hold its position in the face of external threats and internal decay. The destruction caused by the Sea Peoples did not end with the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean civilization, or the weakening of Egypt. The entire political structure of the Eastern Mediterranean was in disarray. Trade routes were disrupted, cities were abandoned, and economies crumbled. The once vibrant cities of the Levant, such as Ugarit, were left in ruins. In Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire created a power vacuum that would be filled by smaller, more decentralized states. The Mycenaeans, too, were left in disarray, with many of their cities abandoned and their palatial economies disintegrating. The Egyptian Empire, though it survived the Sea People's attacks, never regained its former strength. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not a sudden event. It was a process that unfolded over several decades, during which time the various civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean were slowly worn down by environmental stresses, economic decline, political instability, and external invasions. The Sea Peoples were the catalyst that accelerated this process, but they were not the sole cause of the collapse. Their raids on the Hittite, Mycenaean, and Egyptian civilizations served as a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of even the most powerful empires in the face of environmental and social upheaval. In the aftermath of the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a period known as the Dark Age, a time of fragmentation and decline. The large, centralized empires that had once dominated the region gave way to smaller, more localized states. Trade networks collapsed, and many cities were abandoned or reduced to small settlements. The once thriving cultures of the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians were replaced by more rudimentary forms of life. This was a time of cultural regression, where the great achievements of the Bronze Age were forgotten, and the Mediterranean world experienced a long period of economic and social stagnation. Yet, despite the widespread devastation, this period also set the stage for the rise of new civilizations. In the centuries following the collapse, new powers began to emerge. The Phoenicians, for example, took advantage of the disrupted trade networks and established themselves as the premier seafaring traders in the Mediterranean. The Greeks, who had endured the collapse of their Mycenaean civilization, began to re-establish themselves, eventually giving rise to the city-states that would form the foundation of classical Greece. The Israelites, who had been living in the Levant, also began to consolidate power during this period. In this way, the collapse of the Bronze Age served as both a destructive force and a catalyst for the eventual rebirth of Mediterranean civilization. The collapse of the Bronze Age was one of the most profound events in ancient history. It marked the end of a thriving, interconnected world and the beginning of a new era of fragmentation and rebuilding. The Sea Peoples, with their raids and invasions, played a central role in this transformation, but they were only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Environmental stresses, economic decline, and political instability all combined to create a perfect storm of collapse. In the aftermath of this collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean would never be the same. Yet, from the ashes of the old world, new civilizations would rise, forever altering the course of history. The late Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean was not a singular event, but a complex, multifaceted unraveling of civilizations, driven by both external and internal pressures. While the Sea Peoples are often cited as a primary force behind the destabilization of this region, the collapse cannot be fully understood without considering the intricate web of environmental, social, and economic factors that created an ideal environment for widespread upheaval. Among the most significant of these factors were the environmental stresses, particularly prolonged droughts and climate change, that severely impacted the agricultural systems of the time. These environmental changes, combined with social unrest, political instability, and resource scarcity, created a perfect storm that triggered the collapse of some of the most powerful empires of the Bronze Age. Understanding how environmental stresses played a role in the decline of these ancient civilizations requires looking not just at the immediate effects of climate change, but also at the long-term consequences of environmental mismanagement, overexploitation of resources, and shifting agricultural practices. The Mediterranean region, which includes parts of the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant, relies heavily on a Mediterranean climate characterized by wet winters and dry summers. This climate, while generally conducive to agriculture, is also prone to variations. In the centuries leading up to the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, the region began to experience a gradual but significant shift in climate patterns. Evidence from tree rings, ice cores, and sediment layers suggests that the late Bronze Age was marked by a series of prolonged droughts. These droughts were particularly severe in the Eastern Mediterranean, including areas like Anatolia and the Levant, which were crucial for the survival of Bronze Age civilizations. The long-term decline in rainfall would have severely affected crop yields, which were the backbone of the agricultural economy. Agriculture was the lifeblood of the ancient Mediterranean civilizations. In cities such as Mycenae, Ugarit, and Hattusa, the stability of the empire depended on the ability to produce enough food to support large populations. In Mycenaean Greece, for example, the palatial system relied on the efficient management of agricultural resources. The Mycenaeans cultivated grains, olives, and grapes, which were central to their diet and economy. They also raised livestock, including sheep and cattle, which provided meat, wool, and milk. In addition, the Hittites, based in Anatolia, depended on wheat, barley, and legumes, while Egypt, though not as directly affected by the droughts, still saw diminished harvests that had ripple effects throughout the region. When the rains became more erratic, the yield from these crops would have diminished dramatically. The failure of essential crops, such as barley, wheat, and grapes would have led to food shortages, which in turn would have caused economic strain. In many of these societies, the distribution of food was tightly controlled, often managed by royal or elite classes. This centralization of agricultural resources meant that when crop yields plummeted, the ability to feed large urban populations became increasingly difficult. As food became scarce, the price of basic staples would have skyrocketed, leading to increased social unrest. People in the lower classes, who were most dependent on the stability of the food supply, would have been hit hardest by the rising costs of basic necessities. The inability to maintain stable food supplies likely led to internal dissatisfaction and rebellion. The social unrest that followed would have weakened the cohesion of these societies, making it harder for rulers to maintain control. In some cases, this could have manifested as localized revolts or uprisings in the cities and towns. For instance, in Mycenaean Greece, the palatial centers of power, which had once been the hub of Mycenaean political and economic life, were gradually abandoned. Archaeological evidence shows that many Mycenaean sites were destroyed or abandoned during this period, and the palatial system that had governed the society broke down. Some scholars argue that these disruptions were largely driven by food shortages and the consequent breakdown of the economic system. In addition to the agricultural stresses, the decline in food production would have affected trade networks, which were vital for sustaining the economies of the Bronze Age civilizations. The Mediterranean world during the Late Bronze Age was highly interconnected through trade, with the exchange of goods such as tin, copper, olive oil, wine, and textiles forming the backbone of the economy. The Mycenaeans traded extensively with Egypt, the Hittites, and other civilizations, including those in the Levant. The breakdown of agricultural systems would have made it difficult for these civilizations to maintain the production of valuable commodities that fueled trade. With reduced agricultural output, the ability to produce surplus goods for export was severely compromised. As a result, the economic interdependence that had bound these civilizations together began to falter, leading to a collapse of long-standing trade routes. The disruption of trade had cascading effects across the region. The cities of Ugarit, once a thriving port and trade center on the Levantine coast, are among the most prominent examples of this decline. Ugarit's strategic location along trade routes connecting the Aegean, Egypt, and Mesopotamia made it a key player in the Bronze Age economy. Yet, around 1200 BCE, Ugarit was abandoned and its once bustling markets and harbors fell silent. Scholars speculate that Ugarit's decline was not just due to the Sea People's raids, but also due to the collapse of regional trade networks, exacerbated by the agricultural crises. As trade slowed or ceased, cities like Ugarit were left vulnerable to both internal and external pressures, with limited resources to defend against invaders. The growing scarcity of resources, particularly food, was not the only pressure felt by these civilizations. Political instability was another critical factor contributing to their collapse. As the central authority in these civilizations weakened, internal factions began to vie for power, further fragmenting the once unified political systems. The Hittite Empire, for example, had been a dominant power in Anatolia and the Levant for centuries. But internal strife, possibly driven by a lack of food and the erosion of the state's economic base, caused the empire to fragment. The Hittites' loss of control over their far-flung territories made them vulnerable to attacks by the Sea Peoples and other marauding groups. Similarly, in Mycenaean Greece, the weakening of central authority led to the dissolution of the palatial system, with city-states becoming more isolated and decentralized. The political fragmentation of these civilizations created a vacuum that allowed outside forces, such as the Sea Peoples, to exploit their weaknesses. While the Sea Peoples are often depicted as a primary cause of the collapse, their invasions must be seen in the context of these broader socioeconomic and environmental stresses. The Sea Peoples may have been driven by their own environmental pressures, including famine or drought, forcing them to seek new territories for survival. As they moved across the eastern Mediterranean, they attacked and looted cities already weakened by internal unrest and economic decline. The Sea Peoples' raids serve as a catalyst that accelerated the collapse of Bronze Age civilization, but they were not the sole cause of the turmoil. In summary, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations was not an isolated event triggered by a single factor. It was the result of a complex and multifaceted set of circumstances that included environmental changes, internal political instability, economic decline, and external invasions. The agricultural crises caused by prolonged droughts and climate change were among the most significant of these factors. The failure of crops, rising food prices, and breakdown of trade led to widespread social unrest and contributed to the weakening of the political structures that had once supported these civilizations. As these societies became more fragmented and unstable, they became vulnerable to external threats, such as the raids of the Sea Peoples. The collapse of the Bronze Age was thus not just the result of a series of isolated events, but a profound transformation of the Mediterranean world, driven by the combined effects of environmental, economic, and social pressures. The aftermath of this collapse would mark the beginning of a new era, one in which new powers would rise from the ashes of the old civilizations, eventually giving birth to the classical civilizations of Greece, Rome, and the broader Mediterranean world. The unraveling of the Bronze Age civilizations has long been a subject of fascination and intrigue for historians and archaeologists. Central to the collapse of these great civilizations were the sudden and unexpected invasions of the Sea Peoples, a group of seafaring marauders who wreaked havoc on the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BCE. Yet, while the Sea Peoples certainly played a role in the collapse of the great empires of the time, the end of the Bronze Age cannot be solely attributed to their attacks. Instead, the collapse was the result of a confluence of factors that range from environmental change to internal political instability, economic decline, and external invasions. To fully understand this complex and transformative period in history, it is essential to examine the broader context in which the Sea Peoples emerged and how their arrival accelerated the decline of once thriving civilizations. The Bronze Age, spanning from roughly 3,300 BCE to 1200 BCE, was a time of great interconnectedness in the eastern Mediterranean. Civilizations such as the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians in the Nile Valley, and the Phoenicians in the Levant were all part of a vast network of trade, diplomacy, and military alliances. These societies engaged in long-distance trade, exchanging goods such as tin, copper, olive oil, wine, textiles, and precious metals. This exchange of materials not only supported the economies of these civilizations, but also fostered cultural and technological advancements, creating a rich and dynamic world. The cities and empires of this time were connected in ways that fostered prosperity, but also made them vulnerable to the disruptions of external forces. The Mycenaean civilization, which dominated the Aegean region, was one of the most powerful in the Bronze Age. The Mycenaeans built impressive palaces, such as the one at Mycenae, and engaged in extensive trade with Egypt, the Levant, and even as far as Mesopotamia. Similarly, the Hittites, centered in Anatolia, controlled a vast empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the heart of Mesopotamia. Egypt, under the rule of the New Kingdom, stood as a dominant power in the region, with its influence reaching far into Nubia and the Levant. These civilizations, while distinct in their cultures, shared a common reliance on trade and agricultural production for their wealth and stability. But as the 12th century BCE approached, a series of environmental and social factors began to undermine the stability of these civilizations. The region began to experience a series of severe and prolonged droughts, possibly exacerbated by broader climatic shifts. This period of environmental stress affected the agricultural systems that were the foundation of these societies. The failure of crops and the resulting food shortages had immediate economic and social consequences. In places like Mycenae, where agriculture was the backbone of the economy, the loss of crops and the inability to feed growing populations triggered widespread unrest. The Hittite Empire, too, struggled with diminishing agricultural output. The Hittites depended on wheat, barley, and other crops to sustain their large empire, and the failure of these crops due to a changing climate led to widespread famine and economic decline. This agricultural crisis was compounded by internal political instability. The centralized bureaucratic systems that governed these civilizations began to break down under the strain of food shortages and resource scarcity. In Egypt, the weakening of the central government made it increasingly difficult for Pharaoh Ramses III to maintain control over his vast empire. The Mycenaean palatial system, which had once maintained stability through centralized control, also began to disintegrate. Archaeological evidence suggests that the palaces in places like Mycenae and Pylos were abandoned or destroyed during this period, further signaling the collapse of political and social order. At the same time that these internal pressures were destabilizing the great empires, external threats were looming. The Sea Peoples, a coalition of seafaring groups, began to make their presence known on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. The earliest recorded mentions of the Sea Peoples appear in the inscriptions of Pharaoh Merneptah of Egypt, who in 1207 BCE recorded the first encounters with these mysterious invaders. Later, the Egyptian king Ramses III would face a more direct threat from the Sea Peoples. According to Egyptian texts, the Sea Peoples launched a series of raids along the Mediterranean coastline, including the Levant, Anatolia, and Egypt itself. The Sea Peoples' attacks were particularly devastating because they targeted cities and regions already weakened by internal turmoil. The Mycenaean palaces, for example, were already in a state of decline when the Sea Peoples struck, making them easy targets. The Hittites, too, were vulnerable after years of internal strife and environmental pressure. The Sea Peoples, in their raids, exploited these vulnerabilities, bringing destruction to many of the major cities of the Bronze Age world. The city of Ugarit, an important trading hub in the Levant, was sacked and left in ruins. The Hittite capital of Attusa was also destroyed, bringing an end to one of the most powerful empires of the time. The Sea Peoples' raids were not simply acts of barbarism or conquest. Scholars suggest that many of these invaders may have been displaced populations seeking new lands due to the same environmental stresses that were affecting the settled civilizations. Famine, drought, and social unrest likely drove many groups to take to the sea in search of new resources and better conditions. The Sea Peoples, then, were not only invaders but also victims of the same broader forces that were destabilizing the civilizations they attacked. This sense of desperation may explain why these groups banded together to form a formidable coalition that was capable of devastating entire regions. The Egyptian records, particularly those from the reign of Ramses III, describe a massive invasion by the Sea Peoples, who are depicted as a loose confederation of various tribes and peoples. Among the most famous of these groups are the Peleset, Sheker, Shikalesh, and Denyen. While much about the identity of these groups remains unclear, it is evident that they posed a serious threat to Egypt. Ramses III claimed victory over the Sea Peoples in a series of battles, including a naval engagement, but the damage had already been done. The Sea Peoples' attacks weakened Egypt's ability to control its empire, particularly in the Levant, and contributed to the overall decline of the Egyptian New Kingdom. Despite the apparent success of Ramses III in repelling the Sea Peoples, the damage to Egypt's infrastructure was significant. The attacks disrupted trade routes, which had been the lifeblood of Egypt's economy. As trade routes were severed, Egypt's access to vital resources like timber, copper, and luxury goods became limited. The loss of these resources further compounded Egypt's economic problems, which were already exacerbated by internal strife and the weakening of the central authority. Over time, Egypt's power diminished, and the once great civilization fell into a period of decline. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations did not mark the end of human civilization in the Mediterranean, but it did represent a major turning point. The once thriving cities and empires that had defined the Mediterranean world were now in ruins, their power and influence diminished. The long-standing trade networks that connected the Aegean, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant were fragmented, and many of the great cities of the time were abandoned. This decline paved the way for the rise of new powers in the subsequent Iron Age. In the aftermath of the collapse, smaller, more decentralized societies began to emerge. The Phoenicians, for example, took advantage of the collapse of larger empires and established themselves as the dominant maritime traders in the region. Similarly, the Greeks, who had seen the fall of the Mycenaean civilization, began to rebuild and eventually created the classical city-states that would define the next era of Mediterranean history. These new civilizations, emerging from the ashes of the Bronze Age, would lay the foundations for the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. The Sea Peoples, while largely enigmatic in their origins and identity, played a critical role in the collapse of the Bronze Age. Their raids, while devastating, were not the sole cause of the collapse. They were a symptom of a broader set of environmental, social, and political forces that were destabilizing the ancient world. The Sea Peoples' attacks exposed the fragility of the Great Bronze Age empires and accelerated their decline, but they also paved the way for new civilizations to emerge. The story of the Sea Peoples is thus one of both destruction and transformation, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. While the Sea Peoples' ultimate identity may remain a mystery, their impact on the course of history is undeniable. Their raids may have shattered the old order, but in doing so, they helped to create the conditions for the rise of new powers and the eventual rebirth of the Mediterranean world. As the Bronze Age crumbled under the weight of environmental catastrophes, internal strife, and invasions, a significant shift began to take shape in the wake of this collapse. The great civilizations that once dominated the Mediterranean world, such as the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians, faded into decline, leaving behind a legacy that would, over time, be overshadowed by the rise of new powers. In particular, the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age created a landscape in which new political entities emerged, leading to a slow but steady rebirth of Mediterranean civilization. While much of the great interconnected world of the Bronze Age was dismantled, a new dynamic began to form, eventually paving the way for the classical civilizations of Greece, Phoenicia, and Rome. In the aftermath of the collapse, much of the Eastern Mediterranean entered a period of turmoil and decentralization. The once great palaces of the Mycenaeans, the grand cities of the Hittites, and the flourishing trade networks of the Egyptians had all been shattered. The social and political order that had defined these civilizations disintegrated, and many of the large urban centers were abandoned. Without the powerful, centralized governments and elaborate administrative systems that once coordinated trade and military defense, the region became a patchwork of smaller, localized communities. This fragmentation, while it led to a loss of the grandeur and unity that had characterized the Bronze Age, also created opportunities for new forms of social and political organization to take root. The collapse of the centralized powers marked the beginning of what historians often refer to as the Dark Age of the Mediterranean. This period, which lasted for several centuries, was characterized by a reduction in literacy, a decline in monumental architecture, and a general stagnation in cultural and technological innovation. For the Mycenaeans, this meant the destruction of their palatial centers and the collapse of the well-developed systems of trade and administration that had sustained their society. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mycenae and Pylos suggests that the palatial economy was replaced by more localized and less complex social structures. No longer were there large-scale trade networks, and the once vibrant palaces that had governed the Mycenaean world were left in ruins. This was also a time of depopulation in many areas, as once thriving cities were abandoned or reduced to small settlements. In Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire created a power vacuum that lasted for centuries. The Hittites, who had once controlled a vast and prosperous empire stretching from Anatolia to parts of Syria and Mesopotamia, were replaced by a number of smaller states and tribes. The central authority of the Hittite kings, with their well-organized military and bureaucratic systems, disintegrated, and the region fell into a more fragmented state. The end of the Hittite Empire meant that trade routes through Anatolia, which had once connected the Aegean to the heart of Mesopotamia, were no longer stable. This disruption of trade had a ripple effect on the rest of the Mediterranean, further isolating the smaller communities that survived the Bronze Age collapse. In Egypt, the New Kingdom, which had been one of the most powerful and influential empires in the ancient world, also faced serious challenges in the wake of the Sea People's attacks and the subsequent weakening of the central authority. The reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, who successfully repelled the Sea Peoples, marked the last significant period of Egyptian imperial power in the eastern Mediterranean. Following Ramses III's death, Egypt entered a period of decline, marked by a series of weak rulers, internal strife, and growing pressure from foreign invaders. The loss of Egypt's once thriving trade routes, particularly those that connected the Nile Valley to the Mediterranean and the Levant, compounded the economic difficulties of the period. Despite these challenges, the period following the collapse of the Bronze Age was not devoid of development. In fact, it was during this time that a number of new political entities and cultures began to emerge. While the large, powerful empires of the past were gone, smaller states, tribal confederations, and emerging city-states began to take their place. This fragmentation laid the groundwork for the rise of the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. These new civilizations were built on the ruins of their predecessors, adapting and incorporating elements of the Bronze Age civilizations while also charting new paths forward. One of the most notable of these emerging powers were the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, originally from the coastal region of modern-day Lebanon, became the dominant maritime traders of the Mediterranean in the centuries following the collapse of the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians were exceptional sailors, traders, and shipbuilders, and they quickly established trading colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to parts of Spain. Unlike the empires of the Bronze Age, which had been characterized by large territorial holdings and centralized bureaucratic control, the Phoenicians were a network of city-states united by trade and shared culture. These city-states, including Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, became crucial players in the rebirth of Mediterranean commerce and communication. Through their extensive maritime network, the Phoenicians re-established many of the trade routes that had been disrupted during the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations. They traded in goods such as timber, glass, textiles, and the famous Tyrian purple dye, which became highly prized in the ancient world. The Phoenician success was built on their ability to navigate and dominate the seas, filling the void left by the collapse of the great land-based empires. By the time the Phoenicians established their powerful colony of Carthage, they had become one of the most important civilizations in the Mediterranean. Their influence would last for centuries and would eventually lead to the rise of one of the great rival powers of ancient Rome. Meanwhile, in the Aegean, the Greeks began to rebuild their society in the wake of the Mycenaean collapse. The Greek Dark Age was a period of relative isolation and disorganization, but over time, new forms of political and social organization began to take shape. During this period, the Greeks transitioned from a decentralized and agricultural-based economy to one that was more urbanized and merchant-focused. The development of city-states, or polis, such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most influential political and cultural traditions in history. These city-states were initially small, independent entities, but over time, they would evolve into powerful centers of culture, philosophy, and warfare. The Greek Dark Age also saw the emergence of new forms of art, literature, and religious practice. Though the period lacked the monumental achievements of the Mycenaean civilization, it laid the foundations for the later cultural and intellectual flourishing of classical Greece. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed during this time, preserving the myths and legends of the Greek heroes and gods. These epic poems would have a profound influence on the development of Western literature and thought. The Greeks also began to rediscover their own past, preserving the knowledge of their Bronze Age predecessors while also developing new forms of political and philosophical thinking. In the centuries following the collapse of the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean region saw the gradual reemergence of large empires and complex societies. While the great powers of the past, the Mycenaeans, Hittites, and Egyptians, had disappeared, they were replaced by new civilizations that learned from the mistakes and successes of their predecessors. The Phoenicians and Greeks, in particular, adapted and thrived in the new, fragmented world of the early Iron Age. As these new civilizations developed, they began to lay the groundwork for the rise of the Roman Empire, which would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The collapse of the Bronze Age, marked by widespread upheaval, the fall of great empires, and the rise of new political entities, was a transformative moment in history. Though the immediate aftermath was one of turmoil and decay, it ultimately paved the way for the birth of new powers and the eventual resurgence of Mediterranean civilization. The sea peoples, the climate change, and the internal strife of the old empires all played roles in the collapse, but the aftermath saw new beginnings. The Phoenicians, Greeks, and later Romans would carry forward the legacy of the Bronze Age while also forging their own paths, ensuring that the Mediterranean world would continue to be a center of cultural, political, and economic development for centuries to come. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not the end of civilization in the Mediterranean, but the beginning of a new chapter in the region's long and storied history. In the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world entered a period of profound transformation. The mighty empires that once held sway over vast territories, empires such as those of the Mycenaeans, Hittites, and Egyptians, were brought to their knees. The once interconnected world of trade and diplomacy fragmented, and the once proud civilizations collapsed or retreated into smaller, more localized states. This era, often referred to as the Dark Age by historians, was marked by significant political, social, and economic upheaval. However, in the midst of this chaos, the seeds of new civilizations began to take root, slowly rebuilding what had been lost, and eventually giving rise to the classical civilizations that would shape the course of Western history. As the Old World disintegrated, the Eastern Mediterranean and surrounding regions became a landscape of shifting power structures and emerging new political entities. The collapse had left in its wake a power vacuum, and smaller, more localized societies began to form, adapting to the changing world. Some of these new entities emerged as dominant powers in the coming centuries, while others faded into obscurity. However, what was common among them all was a gradual return to more decentralized forms of governance, where city-states, tribes, and smaller kingdoms rose to prominence, replacing the vast empires that had once dominated the region. This new social order was largely the result of the failure of the centralized, palace-based systems of the Late Bronze Age. The Mycenaeans, for example, had once ruled through a network of palatial centers, where monarchs held absolute power over their subjects. However, after the collapse, these palaces were destroyed and the once great Mycenaean cities were abandoned. This collapse of centralized authority led to the rise of smaller, more isolated communities. In place of the grand palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, local chieftains or warlords began to exert control over their territories. The fall of these centralized political structures also led to a decline in trade and communication, with many regions reverting to a more insular and self-sufficient way of life. In Anatolia, the fall of the Hittite Empire left a similar vacuum. The Hittite heartland, once a thriving center of power, fragmented into smaller kingdoms and city-states. The Hittites had ruled over a vast empire, stretching from Anatolia through parts of Syria and Mesopotamia, but by the end of the 12th century BC, much of this territory was lost to invading groups, including the Sea Peoples. The central authority of the Hittite kings disintegrated, and the region became a patchwork of smaller political entities, each struggling to establish its own dominance. These smaller kingdoms lacked the resources and infrastructure of the Hittite Empire, but over time, they adapted to the changing environment and found new ways to thrive. Some of these kingdoms, such as the Phrygians, would go on to play important roles in the later development of the region, but the collapse of the Hittite Empire marked the end of an era of centralized power in Anatolia. Egypt, too, was irrevocably changed by the collapse. The new kingdom, which had been one of the most powerful empires in the world, began to decline after the attacks of the Sea Peoples and the subsequent weakening of the central government. Although Egypt managed to repel the Sea Peoples under the leadership of Ramses III, the cost of these wars was high, and the long-term effects were devastating. The Egyptian economy, which had relied heavily on the flow of tribute and trade, was severely disrupted. Internal strife, combined with external pressures, led to a gradual decline in Egypt's influence in the region. The centralized, state-driven system that had sustained Egypt for centuries began to erode, and the country entered a period of political fragmentation. Egypt's once mighty empire, which had controlled vast territories stretching from the Levant to Nubia, began to retreat, and many of its former territories were lost to emerging powers.